The fluorescent lights of the midnight rail diner hummed with a low, electric anxiety that usually matched the rhythm of Anna Walker's life. It was 3 a.m., the hour of the desperate and the forgotten. Anna wiped a smear of grease off the laminate counter, her movements robotic from a double shift. Every cent she earned was already promised to the landlord or the pharmacy, leaving her with nothing but the quiet strength that kept her spine straight even when her shoes felt like lead. Then, the heavy glass door swung open, and the hum of the diner didn't just fade, it died. The air pressure in the small room seemed to drop as Michael Peake stepped inside. He was a pillar of midnight against the neon glow of the street. Tall and commanding, his sharp black suit was tailored with a precision that felt like a warning. He didn't just enter a room, he occupied it, claiming every inch of space with a silent, intense authority. Behind him, two men with hard eyes and hands tucked near their waistbands scanned the booths, their presence turning the cozy diner into a tactical kill zone. Anna felt the breath hitch in her throat, but she didn't look away. She watched his eyes, calculating, cold, and dark as obsidian. He was a man used to the world flinching at his shadow, a king whose reputation for discipline and violence was written in the way the other patrons suddenly became very interested in their coffee. But as Michael moved toward the center of the room, the terrifying facade cracked. Clutched in his large, calloused hand was the small, trembling hand of a 5-year-old girl. Kimberly looked like a porcelain doll lost in a storm. Her white dress was pristine, a stark contrast to the grit of the diner, but her face was a mask of silent, inconsolable grief. She wasn't screaming, she was vibrating with a sorrow too heavy for her small frame. Michael stopped, his shadow stretching across the floor. He looked down at his daughter, and for a fleeting second, the legendary Mafia boss looked entirely powerless. His jaw was tight, his posture rigid with an emotional restraint that was suffocating them both. He could command an army, but he couldn't bridge the 6 inches of air between him and his daughter's heart. The silence in the diner grew heavy, thick with the scent of stale coffee and the palpable fear of the guards, who looked ready to bolt or shoot because they didn't know how to handle a child's tears. Michael's eyes swept the room, landing on Anna. He expected her to tremble. He expected her to look at the floor. Instead, Anna tucked her rag into her apron and stepped out from behind the counter. The weight of the silence was crushing, but as she walked toward the man who owned the city, her gaze remained steady. She didn't see a monster. She saw a father drowning in his own strength, and a little girl who was starving for a warmth that Michael Peake didn't know how to give. The sound of her knees hitting the worn linoleum floor echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. The guards gasped, one of them stepping forward as if to intercept her, but Michael raised a single gloved hand. He stayed the man, his gaze fixed on Anna. He had seen people beg for their lives on their knees, but he had never seen someone descend to that level out of choice. Anna ignored the towering giants above her. She placed herself at a perfect eye level with Kimberly. From this vantage point, the Mafia princess was gone. Up close, Anna could see the faint redness around the 5-year-old's eyes and the way her small fingers were white-knuckled as they gripped the hem of her dress. "It's very loud and quiet in here, isn't it?" Anna said, her voice a calm, melodic anchor in the storm. Kimberly's breath hitched. She stopped vibrating, her eyes locking onto Anna's with a mixture of shock and desperate curiosity. No one ever looked her in the eye like this. In her world, adults either looked down at her with forced smiles or avoided her gaze entirely out of fear of her father. Anna reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a plain white paper napkin. With steady fingers, she began to fold it. She didn't look at the paper. She kept her eyes on Kimberly, offering a small, knowing smile. "When I was little," Anna whispered, the guards leaning in to catch the forbidden words, "I used to think that if I didn't say anything, the sad feelings would stay stuck inside like a bird in a cage. But sometimes, birds just need a place to land." With a final, deft twist of her fingers, Anna held out the napkin. It was no longer a piece of trash, it was a perfect, delicate origami flower. Kimberly reached out, her tiny hand hovering over Anna's palm. For the first time that night, the girl's face softened, the untouchable mask finally cracking to reveal the child underneath. Behind them, Michael Peake watched the exchange, his emotional restraint momentarily failing him. He looked at the waitress, really looked at her, and saw a strength that had nothing to do with violence. It was the strength of a bridge built in a world of walls. The guards tensed, their hands shifting instinctively toward the holsters hidden beneath their Italian wool jackets. To them, Anna wasn't a waitress, she was an unscreened variable approaching the most guarded assets in the city. Michael Peake's eyes narrowed, a silent calculation running behind his dark iris as he measured the threat of the woman in the faded apron. The air in the diner turned brittle, ready to shatter at the slightest sudden movement. Anna didn't flinch. She didn't look at the guns or the towering shadow of the man who could end her life with a nod. Instead, she moved with a soft, deliberate grace until she was standing just 2 feet away from the small girl in the white dress. Then, slowly and purposefully, Anna sank to her knees. The following 3 days were a blur of exhaustion and the lingering ghost of a memory. Anna could still feel the weight of Michael Peake's gaze and the fragile touch of Kimberly's fingers against the paper flower. She had returned to the grind of her reality, stale coffee, demanding customers, and the crushing stack of eviction notices sitting on her kitchen table. But the air in her cramped 4th-floor walk-up felt different now, as if the silence was waiting for something to break it. The break came at midnight. A heavy, rhythmic rapping at her door startled Anna from a shallow sleep. She didn't ask who it was. The sheer presence pressing against the wood told her everything she needed to know. When she swung the door open, Michael Peake stood in the dim hallway like a shadow made of iron. He was alone this time, devoid of his usual phalanx of guards, yet he looked no less dangerous. His sharp black suit was gone, replaced by a charcoal overcoat that made him seem even more like a force of nature. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped into her small living room, his eyes scanning the cracked plaster and the worn furniture with a clinical, detached intensity. "You have a gift, Anna Walker," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to make the floorboards hum. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He reached into his coat and withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope. "My daughter has not spoken a word since you left that diner. She hasn't eaten. She sits in her room and stares at a paper flower that is already beginning to wilt." He placed the envelope on her scarred wooden table. "I have advisors, security experts, and the best nannies money can buy. They all fear me. They all fear her. But you looked at her and saw a person. You looked at me and saw a father." Anna stared at the envelope. "I just did what was right, Mr. Peake. I don't need a reward for being human." "This isn't a reward," Michael countered, his voice softening into something dangerously close to an appeal. "It is a necessity. I am offering you a position as Kimberly's personal guardian. Not a nanny. A protector of her spirit." He flipped the envelope open, revealing a contract and a check. The number written on the line was more money than Anna had seen in her entire life, enough to pay her grandmother's medical bills 10 times over and move them into a house where the heaters actually worked. $10,000 a week, Michael stated, his calculating eyes fixed on her face. "You will live at the estate. You will have total authority over her well-being. In exchange, you give her the one thing I cannot, a way back from the dark." Anna looked from the life-changing sum of money to the man who represented everything she feared. She saw the guarded vulnerability in his expression, the desperation of a king who realized his crown couldn't buy his daughter's smile. She thought of the eviction notice and then of Kimberly's lonely eyes. "When do I start?" she asked. "Now," Michael replied, and for the first time, the coldness in his gaze flickered with the faintest spark of relief. The black SUV glided through the iron gates of the Peake estate like a shark entering deep water. Beyond the high stone walls, the world of neon signs and greasy diners vanished, replaced by a hauntingly beautiful landscape of manicured lawns and weeping willows that cast long, skeletal shadows in the moonlight. The house itself was a monolith of glass and dark stone, glowing with an amber light that felt more like a warning than a welcome. As the car pulled into the circular driveway, the door was opened by a man who looked like he was carved from the same cold marble as the foyer. Silas, Michael's second-in-command, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture so rigid it bordered on predatory. His suit was a sharp, clinical gray, and his eyes, pale and unblinking, swept over Anna's thrift store coat and tired face with a disdain that was almost physical. "Mr. Peake," Silas said, his voice as smooth and cold as a razor blade. "The asset has been secured at the shoreline, and the board is waiting for your signature. I didn't realize we were still indulging in domestic distractions." Michael didn't stop walking as he entered the house, his heavy footsteps echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Anna Walker is not a distraction, Silas. She is Kimberly's guardian. See that she is settled in the East Wing. And Silas, treat her with the respect her position demands." Michael disappeared into a private study, leaving Anna alone in the cavernous hallway with a man who looked like he was calculating exactly how long it would take to break her. Silas stepped closer, his presence smelling of expensive cologne and old secrets. He didn't offer to take her bag. "The East Wing is 500 yards that way," Silas whispered, pointing a thin finger toward a darkened corridor. "You've managed to charm a desperate father, Miss Walker, but do not mistake this for a home. This is a fortress, and in a fortress, everything has a function. If you fail to be useful, you become a liability. And we deal with liabilities very efficiently here." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, icy hiss. "Kimberly is the heir to an empire built on blood. She doesn't need empathy. She needs discipline. You are a temporary bandage on a deep wound, and I look forward to the day you start to peel." Without waiting for a response, Silas turned on his heel and vanished into the shadows of the mansion. Anna stood in the center of the gilded cage, the weight of the contract in her pocket suddenly feeling like a lead anchor. The opulence around her was breathtaking, but as she looked at the cold, silent statues and the cameras tucked into every corner, she realized that the Peake estate wasn't just a home for a lonely girl. It was a battlefield, and she had just walked onto the front lines without a single weapon. The silence in the East Wing was absolute, a heavy, sterile thing that felt more like a tomb than a child's bedroom. For 3 days, Anna had watched Kimberly move through the mansion like a ghost in a museum, her tiny feet making no sound on the thick Persian rugs. The rule of the house, enforced by Silas's watchful eye and the stern-faced staff, was simple. No noise, no mess, no disruption to the boss's focus. Anna stood in the center of Kimberly's room, looking at the expensive, untouched toys and the pristine white walls. Kimberly sat on the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the paper flower Anna had made her, now yellowed and fraying at the edges. The girl wasn't just quiet, she was disappearing into the shadows of the estate. "This room is too white, Kimmy," Anna said softly, her voice cutting through the stillness like a stone through glass. Kimberly looked up, her brow furrowed in confusion. Anna didn't wait for a response. She walked to the closet and pulled out a stack of large, high-grade architectural drafting paper she had scavenged from the library, along with a set of vibrant, expensive acrylics Michael had likely bought to look like a good father, but never opened. "Silas says we must be quiet," Kimberly whispered, her voice tiny and rusty from disuse. "Papa doesn't like the mess." "Then we won't use our voices," Anna replied, kneeling on the floor and spreading the paper across the expensive hardwood. "We'll use our hands." Anna dipped her fingers directly into a jar of deep, midnight blue and smeared a bold, sweeping stroke across the white page. Kimberly gasped, her eyes widening as if she expected the walls to crumble. When nothing happened, Anna dipped into a bright, defiant yellow and handed the jar to the girl. "Show me what the loud quiet feels like," Anna encouraged. Slowly, tentatively, Kimberly reached out. She dipped a single finger into the paint and touched the paper. Then, another. Within an hour, the no-noise rule was being shattered by the rhythmic slap-squelch of wet paint and the frantic, joyful scratching of brushes. They weren't painting flowers or suns, they were painting the dark, swirls of obsidian, flashes of crimson, and jagged streaks of gold that looked like lightning. Kimberly's face was smeared with cerulean, her white dress ruined, but for the first time, her eyes were alive. She was laughing, a small, bubbling sound that echoed down the hallway where the guards stood frozen in shock. The door creaked open, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Silas stood on the threshold, his face pale with fury as he took in the colorful carnage on the floor. "What is the meaning of this insolence?" Silas hissed, his gaze darting to the ruined rug. I gave you a direct order. This house is a place of order, not a playground for. It's a language, Silas, Anna interrupted, not standing up, not flinching. She looked at him from her position on the floor, her hand resting protectively on Kimberly's paint-stained shoulder. She finally has something to say. Are you going to be the one to tell her father that you silenced her? Silas's jaw tightened, his pale eyes burning with a silent promise of retribution, but as he looked at Kimberly, who was staring back at him with a newfound defiance, he found no words. He backed out of the room, but the look he gave Anna was a clear declaration. The temporary bandage had just become a target. The grand ballroom of the Peake estate was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp tuxedos, a place where the city's elite gathered to trade favors under the guise of a charity auction. Anna stood in the shadows of the velvet curtains, her own modest black gown feeling like a disguise. Kimberly stood beside her, small and stoic, her hand tucked firmly into Anna's. The girl's eyes constantly sought out her father, who commanded the center of the room, his presence a gravitational force that kept the world in orbit. The evening was supposed to be a triumph of order, yet the air felt thick and static. Anna noticed it first, the way the security detail was shifting. Men she had seen every day for weeks were being replaced by faces she didn't recognize, and the guards at the north exit were moving away from their posts. Stay close, Kimmy, Anna whispered, her instinct for survival, honed by years of late-night shifts in dangerous neighborhoods, screaming a warning. Silas appeared at the podium to announce the final lot, a rare diamond known as the heart of the shore. As he spoke, he caught Anna's eye. He didn't look angry as he had in the painting room. He looked satisfied. He tapped his earpiece twice, a gesture so subtle it would have been missed by anyone else, but Anna saw the glint of the overhead chandeliers reflect off a small, silver device tucked into his palm. It wasn't a radio. It was a remote. The lights didn't just go out, they exploded. The sound of shattering glass rained down like diamonds as the massive chandeliers were detonated by small, localized charges. Screams tore through the darkness, followed immediately by the rhythmic, terrifying thud-thud-thud of silenced gunfire. Down! Anna roared, throwing herself over Kimberly, just as a spray of bullets riddled the woodwork where they had been standing seconds before. In the chaotic strobing of emergency flares, Anna looked toward Michael. He was pinned down behind a marble pillar, fighting off 3 attackers. She expected to see Silas at his side, defending the boss. Instead, she saw Silas stepping calmly through the carnage, flanked by 2 of the new guards. He wasn't looking for the attackers, he was pointing them toward Michael's blind spot. Silas turned his head, his pale eyes finding Anna in the wreckage. He didn't look surprised that she was still alive, he looked disappointed. He signaled to the gunman, pointing directly at the white dress huddled beneath Anna's protective frame. The hit wasn't an outside invasion. It was an execution from within. We have to go now, Anna hissed into Kimberly's ear. She didn't wait for Michael's orders or a guard's help. She grabbed the girl and dove through the shattered remains of the floor-to-ceiling windows, disappearing into the dark, rainy woods of the estate as the sound of betrayal echoed in the ballroom behind them. The engine of the battered sedan Anna had hotwired in the estate's secondary garage hummed a low, desperate tune as they reached the edge of the Atlantic. The city, with its exploding chandeliers and Silas's cold betrayal, felt like a nightmare from another lifetime. Here, the air was thick with salt and the rhythmic, percussive roar of the tide hitting the jagged rocks. The safe house was a weathered saltbox cottage tucked into a cove where the trees grew sideways from the wind. It was the only property Michael owned that wasn't on the official books, a secret kept even from his inner circle. When the black SUV he had used to escape the estate finally pulled into the tall grass behind them, Anna didn't lower her weapon until Michael stepped out. He was a ghost of the man who had entered the diner. His sharp black suit was torn, his white shirt stained with a blooming Rorschach test of crimson from a graze on his shoulder. He moved with a heavy, uncharacteristic limp, but his eyes immediately sought out the small figure huddled in the passenger seat. Inside the cottage, the only light came from a dying fireplace. The grand, commanding posture that defined Michael Peake had finally buckled. He sat on a worn wooden bench, his head bowed, the firelight catching the gray at his temples that Anna hadn't noticed before. He looked less like a king and more like a man who had realized his throne was built on quicksand. "He was my brother in everything but blood," Michael said, his voice a hollow rasp that barely carried over the sound of the waves. He didn't look up. "Silas. I gave him my trust, and he used it to measure the distance to my heart." Anna moved toward him, not with the deference of an employee, but with the steady presence of an equal. She set a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth on the table. Kimberly, sensing the shift in the air, climbed onto the bench beside her father. She didn't cry. Instead, she reached out and placed her small hand on Michael's uninjured arm. For the first time since Anna had met him, the Mafia boss let out a long, shuddering breath. His emotional restraint, the iron mask he wore to keep the world at bay, finally crumbled. He didn't sob, but he leaned his forehead against Kimberly's small shoulder, closing his eyes as his hand gripped hers with a desperate, white-knuckled intensity. "I thought I could protect her by being a wall," he whispered, his eyes opening to find Anna's in the dim light. "I thought if I was cold enough, no one could burn us. But I was just making her live in the dark." In that moment of shared vulnerability, the king's ransom no longer mattered. The money, the fortress, and the power were gone, stripped away by the salt and the sea. As the moon climbed over the coast, Anna realized that the sanctuary wasn't the house, it was the quiet, bleeding truth between them. They were no longer a boss, a child, and a waitress. They were three people holding on to each other in the center of a rising storm. The salt-heavy wind battered the sides of the cottage, a relentless drumming that masked the sound of the world outside. Inside, the fire had settled into a low, rhythmic orange glow. Michael had finally drifted into a fitful, feverish sleep, his hand still loosely entwined with Kimberly's as she dozed against his side. The sight was a fragile piece, but for Anna, the silence was still too loud. She sat at the small, scarred kitchen table with Michael's discarded tablet, a sleek, high-end piece of hardware that looked out of place in the rustic room. Its screen was cracked from the ballroom struggle, but it flickered to life when she touched the glass. Michael had given her his override codes back at the estate, a gesture of trust that Silas had surely intended to use against them. Anna navigated to the estate's internal security cloud. Most of the feeds were dead, showing only static or the charred remains of the ballroom. But then, a hidden ghost channel, tucked deep within the system's subdirectory, caught her eye. It was a private feed from the library, the very room where Silas had spent his hours, managing the board. The video was time-stamped 30 minutes before the gala. In the grainy night vision green of the frame, Silas was leaning against Michael's desk, his posture relaxed, almost triumphant. He wasn't alone. Standing across from him was a man Anna recognized from the news, Victor Cross, the head of the rival syndicate Michael had been fighting for years. The audio was muffled by the wind outside, but as Anna boosted the gain, the betrayal became crystal clear. "The charges are set," Silas's voice hissed through the speakers, devoid of its usual polished veneer. "The chandeliers will drop at 9. In the chaos, my men will take the girl. Michael won't survive the crossfire, and with the heir in my possession, the Peake territory becomes ours." Cross's voice was a low growl. "And the waitress?" "A non-entity," Silas dismissed, a cruel sneer audible in his tone. "A temporary distraction to keep Michael's eyes off the security rotation. She'll die with the rest of the staff. I've planted a secondary tracker in the girl's favorite sketchbook, the one the waitress encouraged her to use. They'll lead us straight to the shoreline when they run." Anna's blood turned to ice. She looked over at the counter, where Kimberly's paint-streaked sketchbook lay open. It had been their bridge, their sanctuary, and Silas had turned it into a beacon for their execution. She didn't scream. She didn't wake Michael. Instead, she stood up, her movements fluid and silent as she grabbed a kitchen knife and moved toward the book. She tore through the heavy binding, her fingers searching the spine until she felt a hard, cold lump. She pulled out a wafer-thin GPS wire, its red light blinking like a steady, mocking heartbeat. They weren't safe. They were a target, and the shadows of the coastal trees were no longer a refuge, they were a trap. Silas wasn't coming for a negotiation, he was coming to finish the job, and he was already on his way. The storm outside peaked just as the first headlights cut through the salt spray. Anna didn't wait for the engine to cut or the doors to fly open. She moved with a cold, lethal clarity, grabbing Michael's heavy service weapon from the bedside table. She wasn't a waitress anymore, she was the only thing standing between the dark and the child she had come to love. "Michael, wake up!" she hissed, her voice low and sharp. He bolted upright, his hand instinctively reaching for the empty space on the nightstand. Anna met his gaze, her eyes hard and steady as she pressed the weapon into his hand. "Silas is here." The sketchbook was bugged. "He's already at the perimeter." Michael's face didn't register fear. It registered a terrible, quiet fury. He struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on Anna's shoulder as they hurried Kimberly toward the cellar hatch hidden beneath the kitchen rug. "Stay down, Kimmy," Anna whispered, kissing the girl's forehead. "Don't come out until you hear my voice. Not Papa's. Not anyone else's. Only mine." The front door splintered inward just as the hatch clicked shut. Silas stepped into the room, flanked by two men holding submachine guns. He looked around the rustic kitchen with a sneer, his eyes finally landing on Anna, who stood in the center of the room with a kitchen knife in one hand and a flare gun in the other. "The help still thinks she's a hero," Silas mocked, his voice barely audible over the crashing waves. "Move aside, Anna. I only need the girl. I might even let you live to wait tables in another city." "You don't get it, Silas," Anna said, her voice dropping to a dangerous level. "I'm not the help. I'm the person who actually sees what's coming." She fired the flare gun directly into the open gas line she had severed moments before behind the stove. The kitchen erupted in a blinding flash of orange heat. In the chaos of the explosion, Michael emerged from the shadows of the hallway like a vengeful ghost, his gun barking as he took down the two mercenaries. Silas dove for cover, but Anna was faster. She lunged through the smoke, the weight of her desperation lending her a strength she didn't know she possessed. They tumbled out of the cottage and onto the jagged rocks of the shoreline. Rain lashed at them as they struggled near the cliff's edge. Silas pinned her down, his fingers tightening around her throat. "You were just a waitress," he spat. Nobody knows how to survive a graveyard shift," Anna choked out. She drove her knee into his wounded side and shoved him back with all her might. Silas's foot slipped on the slick, mossy rock. He clawed at the air, his eyes wide with the realization that the temporary bandage had just ended his empire. He vanished into the churning black foam of the Atlantic without a sound. When the silence returned, Michael was there, standing at the edge of the rocks, his arm wrapped around a trembling Kimberly. He looked at Anna, her clothes torn, her face smeared with soot and salt, and he didn't see an employee. He walked to her, pulling her into the circle of their protection. "It's over," Michael whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "You saved us." "I saved my family," Anna corrected softly. The shadows of their past were still there, but as the first gray light of dawn broke over the ocean, Anna knew she wasn't going back to the diner. She had walked through the fire, and she had come out as the heart of the Peake family.